I don't know how many of you follow the National Football League, but there's a coach in the NFL. He's the former coach of the Houston Oilers and the Tennessee Titans. His name is Bum Phillips, and Bum Phillips once made this statement. He said there are two kinds of coaches in the NFL, those that have been fired and those that are going to be fired. Apparently, the life expectancy of a coach in the NFL is not that great. You may be sitting there thinking, Pastor, what in the world does that have to do with a sermon on grief? Well, this statement applies to our study on the subject of grief in this way. There are two kinds of people in this room today. There are those that have already experienced some form of grieving and those that are going to. I said last week that the principles that we're learning about grief may not apply to you today. I said that they may apply to you 5 hours from now, 5 days from now, 5 months from now. When I said that last Sunday, Jim and Juanita were both in the service. Now Juanita is here alone. The book of Job says that man born of woman, that's everybody, is a few days and full of trouble. And the fact is, we live in a sin-cursed world. This world is not what God intended for it to be. You and I have never seen this world the way God intended for it to be. What we've seen is a world that has been wrecked and ruined because of man's sin. When sin came into the world, death came with it. When sin came into the world, disease and despair came with it. In another one of these sermons on encouragement, I used the illustration of a train. I said, imagine that a man has never seen a train and you're trying to explain to him what a train looks like and how a train travels on its tracks and how those great mighty engines are able to pull all of those train cars. And then suppose you say, well, look, let me just show you one. We'll go down to the depot and I'll show you a train. Be better for me to show you than to tell you. So you go down to the train depot, and just before you get there, there was a terrible train wreck. And when you arrive at the depot, the train cars are laying over on their side. People are moaning and screaming. There's mangled steel and metal everywhere. Fire and smoke are billowing towards the sky. And you point to that train wreck and you say, now that's what I was trying to tell you. That's a train. All right, let me ask you a question. At that point, has the man seen a train? Technically, yes. But what he's really seen is a train wreck. You and I have never seen this world the way God intended for it to be. We've only seen this world after it was wrecked and ruined by sin. Because of that, man born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. And sometimes that trouble comes in the form of the ending or the termination of relationships. Sometimes those relationships are ended because of death. Sometimes because of divorce. Sometimes because of a falling out or a misunderstanding. When you love somebody and when you care about somebody, then when that relationship ends, you are going to grieve over that lost relationship. And I said last week that the only way to never experience grief is to never experience loving relationships. And that's not a good trade-off. The fact is, there is no human relationship on this earth that is permanent. That's not going to come to pass until we get to heaven. By the way, I look forward to that day. As I read the book of Revelation, there's a passage that uses the phrase no more over and over and over. I love the no mores of heaven. No more sorrow. No more grief. No more death. No more tears. I look forward to the day of no more broken homes. No more broken hearts. No more broken dreams. I look forward to the day of no more hospitals. No more nursing homes. No more funeral homes. I look forward to that day. But until that day comes, there is no human relationship that's permanent. And so when we lose a relationship, we grieve over that lost relationship. And the grieving process may last for days, it may last for months, it may even last for years. The point is this: you will never be the same again. But you can go forward. Let me repeat that. You will never be the same again, but you can go forward. You can continue to live a productive life in a productive way for others and for God. It is not God's will that you shrivel up and die, physically or emotionally, when the relationship dies. I said last week that I watched my grandmother grieve herself literally to death within months after my grandfather died. That's not what Grandpa would have wanted. And that's not what God would want. Grief does not have to destroy us. And the only time, and I say this lovingly, the only time grief does destroy us is when we allow it to. There is a way to handle grief in a godly way. In this passage, David is grieving over the death of Saul, who is his father-in-law, and the death of Jonathan, who is his best friend. Let's sort of eavesdrop as David grieves. Look at verse 12. And they mourned and wept and fasted until even or evening for Saul, and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. Notice verse 17. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And then from verse 18 to the end of the chapter, we have recorded the words of David's lamentation, which we'll look at a little later. There are several principles from this text that we can apply to our own lives. We're using the word grief as an acrostic, G-R-I-E-F. G stands for grant that a loss has occurred. We talked about that last Sunday. And we talked last Sunday about not trying to minimize your grief, not trying to deny your grief. If grief is pushed down and stuffed away, it will later come out in ways that are unhealthy and undesirable. I read this week where one man described it as a volcano. He said if grief is pushed down and stuffed away, then someday at the most unexpected time, it will erupt like a volcano. Now, we talked about that last week. If you weren't here last week, I'd really encourage you to listen to that message. You can order a CD or you can listen to it for free on our website. The second thing we want to talk about is the letter R. And the letter R stands for resist bitterness. This chapter records David's words when David was grieving. And I want to point something out. Notice verse 18. Notice what he says in verse 18. Verse 19. Look at verse 19. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Jump down, if you would, to verse 25. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jump down to verse 27. How are the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? 3 times David says, how is this possible? How could this happen? David didn't understand. David has questions in his mind. And yet there is no record of David's anger and or questioning turning to bitterness. No bitterness towards God. No bitterness towards others. Sometimes as Christians, we get angry during times of grieving. Sometimes we're angry with ourselves, thinking of what we could have done, should have said, how things should have been or could have been. Sometimes we get angry with others, thinking what they could have done, should have done. And sometimes we even get angry with God. Let me just tell you today, that's a very common emotion. Here's why. We've been taught all our life that God is love, that God cares about us. And we have trouble reconciling the fact that God loves us and cares about us with the fact that He would allow our hearts to be broken. We struggle with that. And the whole point that I want to make today is this. If anger towards God, which is normal, and if questioning God, which is normal, is not dealt with properly, then it can turn to bitterness. And bitterness is extremely destructive. If you become bitter towards the Lord, it will always result in one of 2 things. Either you will deny your faith and quit serving God altogether, and quit going to church, and you'll quit praying, you just quit altogether, or you'll just continue to go through the motions, but you know that you are a hollow, empty shell. and that inside there's no real relationship with the Lord, that you're just going through the motions. I want to help you with that today, because I've seen so many people go through this, including members of my own family. And I want to give you 3 things that you should remember when you feel angry so that you can resist bitterness. Number 1, reaffirm your faith through prayer. The temptation during these times is to quit praying. We do it for 2 reasons. Sometimes we do it because we're just so discouraged. And we say, well, why should I pray? I prayed for my loved one to be healed and God didn't answer that prayer. Why should I? What good does it do? Sometimes we quit praying simply because we're giving God the silent treatment. We are so angry and so bitter towards God, we don't even want to talk to Him. I've seen people go through this. Sometimes husbands and wives will do this to one another. They'll give each other the silent treatment. I know of one husband and wife relationship, and that's her common way of punishing her husband when she's not happy. She gives him the silent treatment. I've seen this woman go for days, weeks, months without talking to her husband. Sometimes we do that to God. We give God the silent treatment. I want to share with you a couple of true testimonies. It's from an article titled, How to Handle Anger with God. It says, when Kevin's 4-month-old daughter suddenly stopped breathing one night and died in her crib, a victim of sudden infant death syndrome, he was devastated. He felt, however, that expressing any anger at God would show a lack of faith because he, quote, shouldn't feel that way. Having always considered himself a religious person, Kevin did not want to add lack of faith to his other problems. Therefore, he clung tightly to a faith which forbids any expression of anger at God, a faith which risks becoming increasingly hollow. Unfortunately, his prayers run that same risk. Brenda's college-age son fell asleep at the wheel and was killed in a 1-car crash. Brenda had no trouble admitting her anger at God, but some of her friends, family, and co-workers were very uncomfortable with that anger. They began to dread any conversation which might trigger a reference to Brenda's dead son. In her own words, she raised blank, asking God a lot of hard questions. Brenda expected some answers. Eventually, she found a few people who could handle her anger and decided to keep going to church until she got the answers she sought. Brenda did not consider being angry with God a good reason to quit praying. What would you do if you were in Kevin's or Brenda's place? What would you do when a family member, friend, or coworker faces a similar tragedy? Do you automatically say that these deaths were, quote, God's will? That the grieving parent shouldn't be angry and should, quote, get over it or get on with life? Do you send out the message that prayer is only for people who have calmed down and gotten their act together? Deaths such as Kevin and Brenda experienced, or major losses, such as an amputated limb, blindness, or mastectomy, force Christian people to one of 3 reactions. Number 1, denying their faith, or number 2, going through the motions, or number 3, reaffirming their faith in a new way. Now, the point is, don't quit praying if you find yourself angry with God. Here's what you need to do. You need to pour your heart out to God and tell Him how you feel. The Bible says that God's grace is always sufficient, right? But God's grace is not always the absence of anger. Do not think of those 2 things as being mutually exclusive. Either I have God's grace or I'm angry. I can't have both. Grace is not always the absence of anger. Grace is the ability to allow God to help you work through that anger. And the worst thing you can do is bottle it up. The worst thing you can do is pretend it's not there. Because once we admit it, and only after we admit it, then are we free to deal with it, and then is God free to help us with it. So number 1, reaffirm your faith in prayer. Do not quit praying. And you don't have to fake it with God. You can tell Him exactly how you feel. Number 2, remember, God is not threatened by our anger or our questions. Let me ask you a question. What kind of a God would he be if he was so fragile that we couldn't be honest about how we feel? Now, I know that we feel that way sometimes because some of our human relationships are like that. Some of you have a spouse or a friend that you've got to walk on eggshells around. Their emotions are so fragile that you do everything you can to protect them from anything that might upset them. Well, let me just tell you, God is not like that. Well, what kind of a God would we serve if he was so fragile that we couldn't just tell him how we feel? I want you to notice what David said, the man we're talking about here. Notice what David said in Psalms 13, 1 through 4. Look at it on the screen. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? I hear anger. Do you? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. God, this is going to kill me if you don't do something. Lest mine enemies say, I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. Leave that up. Here you have a man that is pouring his heart out to God. He's telling God exactly how he feels. He's not keeping it all bottled up inside. He's not in denial. He's not pretending it's not there. And do you know what happened because he did this? God helped him work through it. It is amazing the shift between verse 4 and verse 5. Obviously, immediately after pouring his heart out to God, something happened in his soul. Something happened in his spirit. Notice what happens in verse 5 after he tells God how he feels. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord because he hath dealt bountifully with me. Do you know what I see there? I see the grace of God rushing into this man's life. Consider the following true testimony. By the time I was a junior in high school, I had done my share of complaining that life isn't fair. But nothing really shook my faith in God until 2 nephews were born several months prematurely and died a few days later. What did I believe about God now? What could I say to my grieving brother and sister-in-law? I was away at school, and I remember my father's letter saying that my nephews had been born and that I should pray for their survival. Up to that time, I had prayed for various people, but never for someone literally in a life or death situation. Earlier petitions might have concerned more trivial matters, but this was big league praying. Here was the clearest and most painful case of innocent suffering I had ever encountered. How could God not hear my prayers and those of our whole family for those tiny infants? For some reason, I felt confident that they would make it, and therefore I was devastated when I learned that my nephews had died. How could a good God let this happen? I asked with hurt and anger. To say that my nephews died of natural causes seemed heartless and dishonest. Furthermore, I could not believe that their deaths were God's will, at least in the sense that that's what God really wanted. Nevertheless, at that time, I thought that nice people never get angry at God. Though puzzled and hurt, they somehow get over it, and life goes on. Slowly, my confusion and anger subsided, and life returned to a new kind of normalcy. 2 years later, my brother and sister-in-law had a healthy baby girl, and I was ready to let God off the hook, so to speak. Years later, when I read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book and reflected on other experiences of loss, I began to see the danger of a faith which is more nice than honest. Let me repeat that. I began to see the danger of a faith which is more nice than honest. Admitting our anger with God does not destroy faith, but rather forces us to clarify what we believe and why. To move from a child's faith to an adult's faith. Though refusing to admit anger with God may seem to protect one's faith, I am convinced that in the long run, it does more harm than good. God is not threatened when you pour your heart out to Him. Did you know that even Jesus at one point in time in his life asked God why? Do you remember when Jesus was hanging on the cross? All of our sins were heaped upon him. And for the first time in eternity, God the Father turned his back on God the Son. The fellowship was broken because of our sin. Jesus said, my God, what's the next word? Why? Why hast thou forsaken me? I would contend that it's not always a sin to ask God why. What we have to guard against is letting anger turn to bitterness. What we have to guard against is letting our questioning turn into bitterness. Again, grace is not the absence of anger. Grace is not the absence of questions. It is God giving you the ability to work through it that it might not turn to bitterness. Number 3, realize that tragedy is no respecter of persons. No one is immune to the possibility of tragedy. Tragedy and grief happens to everyone. We try to fool ourselves into thinking that we're immune to death, or that our family members are immune to a premature death or disaster. I'll be honest with you, the better we have it and the more privileged we are, the more devastated we are when the hurts of life come to us. Listen to what King David said in Psalms 30. This is after he was king. Psalm 30 and verse 6. And in my prosperity I said, I shall never be moved. Can I paraphrase that for you? That's the king saying, when I felt secure, then I said, I'll never be shaken. Nothing can shake me. He was the king. He was secure. And his security made him feel invincible. He had wealth. He had power. He had bodyguards. But David soon discovered that his own self-reliance was not enough to protect him from tragedy. And in the very next verse, notice what he said. Lord, by thy favor thou hast made my mountain to stand strong. Thou didst hide thy face, and I was troubled. Do you see the contrast? He said, I had the favor of God. I had a privileged position. And that caused me, when trouble came to my house, to feel like God was nowhere around and to feel like God had turned his face on me. He was devastated. And so many times, the more privileged we are, the more devastated we are when trouble does come. So what am I saying? Don't believe the lie which causes us to say, I'm immune from this type of tragedy. I'm immune to this type of heartache, or it could never happen to me. If we go through life thinking it could never happen to me, then when it does come, the hurt and the anger and the bitterness is compounded. Nobody in this room that has ever experienced the sudden death of a spouse expected it to happen to them. In 1996, my mom was shopping for a dress. When my dad walked into the store from the car where he'd been reading the paper, holding his chest, fell to the floor. And just like that, 42 years of marriage had ended. She never expected it to happen to her. She had a good life. She had a comfortable life. She had a wonderful son. What more could you ask for? And just like that, it was over. I was reading a testimony by one pastor this week who said this. He said his church was having divorce recovery classes. And he said they put a big sign in the foyer. Christian divorce recovery classes. And then it gave the time. He said, I was standing in the lobby one day and I overheard two ladies talking. And they were standing there looking at the poster. And he said one of them looked at the other and very arrogantly said, Christian divorce? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? To which the other one agreed and say, oh, yes. Why? Christians should never get divorced. He said as they walked off, he said, I honestly felt sorry for them. He said, because God forbid if one of their husbands should go off the deep end and leave, he said their problem will be compounded tenfold by the mindset, it could never happen to me. Please don't misunderstand me this morning. I'm not saying you should stand around and wait for bad things to happen. I'm not saying you should live with a sense of dread. I'm not saying you should walk around with a cloud over your head. But what I am saying is this. I'm saying, don't think you're impenetrable. Don't think you're invincible. Folks, sometimes reality sets in for everybody. And to walk around with this attitude that it could never happen to me is just not realistic. Now, obviously, we pray, we hope, we ask God that it would never happen, that we would never have to go through what others have gone through. But to think, my finances are immune to reversal. My marriage is immune to trouble. My kids are immune from rebellion. My body is immune to cancer. I'm immune to falling into deep sin. Let me tell you something. There's a big difference between saying, I would never do that, and saying, by the grace of God, I would never do that. Big difference. Big difference. A year ago, Brother Tom and I were, and Brother Wes, were in Woodstock, Georgia, attending a conference on church growth. The pastor was Johnny Hunt. Pastor is one of the largest churches in America. Great soul winner. And he's been through a long bout with cancer. And he opened up his heart and he testified to us. He said, when I first got cancer, I went through a period of time of saying, why me? Why me, Lord? Why me? I'm trying to serve you. I'm winning souls. I'm trying to pastor a church. I'm trying to help other preachers. Why me? He said, then all of a sudden, one day, it just occurred to me. Why not me? He said, I'm the one telling other people how to get through it, and I've never been through it myself. I'm the one telling other people that God's grace is sufficient, and I've never modeled it. He said, all of a sudden, God spoke to my heart. Here's your chance to model for the people what you've been telling them to do. We have several people like that here in our church that I thank God for. Miss Pauline, your husband was a pastor. Your whole life revolved around his ministry. You have modeled for us how a woman continues to serve God even after the rug is pulled out from under her. And I thank you for that. Rayburn and Ernestine, you had a son that died. He was just a teenager. You have modeled for us how you keep serving God even after the rug is pulled out from under you. And we thank you for that. Miss Janet, you've modeled for us in the last few months how to keep serving God even after putting your baby in the ground. And I thank you for that. I think sometimes we need to get past why me and get to the place where we can say, why not me? And ask God to help us be a testimony. We can only do that by His grace, and we can only do that if we work through our anger and do not allow it to become bitterness. In Psalm 30, David's transfer to God was obvious. Psalm 30, David said, and in my prosperity I said, I shall never be moved. Lord, by thy favor thou hast made my mountain to stand strong. Thou didst hide thy face, and I was troubled. But now wait a minute. I cried to thee, O Lord, and unto the Lord I made my supplication. When he felt that God was nowhere around, he kept praying. And by God's grace, he worked through it. And God will do the same for us. Same for you. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, most of our whys will remain unanswered until we get to heaven. There was a pastor by the name of Jack Hyles that sat down one day and he thought about all the people that had come to him as a pastor and asked why. And he sat down and he put it in his own words this way. I've sat beside a tiny crib and watched a baby die as parents slowly turned toward me to ask, "Oh, pastor, why?" I have held the youthful husband's head and felt death's heave and sigh. A widow looked through tears and said, "Dear pastor, tell me why." I have seen a gold star mother weep and hold a picture nigh her lonely breast and softly ask, "Why, pastor, why, oh, why?" I've walked away from babyland where stillborn babies lie. A mother stretches empty arms and asks me, "Pastor, why?" I have heard the white tip tapping cane, which leads a blinded eye. And then a dark and lonely voice cries, "Preacher, show me why." I have caught a fiance's burning tears and heard her lonely cry. She held an unused wedding gown and shouted, "Pastor, why?" I've heard the cancer patient say, "'Tis gain for me to die," then look into his daughter's face and mutely whisper, "Why?" I've seen a father take his life. A widow stands nearby as little children say, "Dear Mom, the preacher, he'll tell us why." I've seen my mother stand beside two tiny graves and cry. And though she'd never let me know, I know she wondered why. I've heard an orphan faintly say, who gazed into the sky, "Though Mom and Dad have gone away, my preacher will know why." I tiptoed to my Father's throne, so timid and so shy, to say, "Dear God, some of your own are wanting to know why." I heard him say so tenderly, "Their eyes I'll gladly dry. Though they must look through faith today, tomorrow they'll know why." If now they find the reasons that their hopes have gone awry, in heaven they will miss the joy of hearing me tell why. And so I've found it pleases him when I can testify. I'll trust my God to do what's best and wait to find out why. Let's pray.